The hidden philosophy of power. Main story: the Emperor's secret garden. You know, there's something quietly beautiful about discovering that the most powerful people in history were, in many ways, just trying to figure things out like the rest of us. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, let me tell you about a secret that Roman emperors kept, not in locked vaults or hidden chambers, but in their own minds. A secret written in private journals, practiced in the quiet hours before dawn, and carefully concealed behind the marble facades of absolute power. This is the story of Stoicism. And before you think this is going to be some dry philosophical lecture, let me assure you, it's far more human than that. Picture this. It's the year 170 CE. You're standing outside a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube River. Inside, by candlelight, the most powerful man on earth is writing. Not battle plans, not imperial decrees. He's writing reminders to himself. Reminders to be kind. Reminders that his anger doesn't matter. Reminders that death is natural and nothing to fear. His name is Marcus Aurelius, and he has no idea that 2,000 years later, people will still be reading his private thoughts, searching for the same peace he sought. But let's back up, because this story doesn't begin with Marcus Aurelius. It begins about 500 years earlier, in a place that might surprise you. The year is approximately 300 BCE. You're in Athens, in a painted colonnade called the Stoa Poikile. The name literally means painted porch, and it's here, under these covered walkways decorated with murals of ancient battles, that a man named Zeno is teaching something revolutionary. Not revolutionary in the loud, dramatic sense, but revolutionary in the way that shifts how you see everything. Zeno wasn't even Athenian. He was from Cyprus, and according to the stories that have survived, he ended up in Athens almost by accident. He was a merchant whose ship was wrecked off the coast of Greece. Standing in an Athenian bookshop, broke and far from home, he picked up a book about Socrates. Something in those pages spoke to him so deeply that he decided, right there, to abandon commerce and pursue philosophy. Imagine that. Your entire life plan washed away with a shipwreck, and instead of despair, you find purpose in a bookshop. Zeno began teaching in that painted porch, the Stoa, and his followers became known as Stoics. The philosophy he developed wasn't about being emotionless or cold, despite what modern usage of the word might suggest. It was about something far more subtle and, honestly, far more useful. The core idea? You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond. Your ship sinks? That's outside your control. Your reaction to it? That's entirely yours. Someone insults you? Outside your control. Whether you let it ruin your day? Your choice. Sounds simple, doesn't it? And yet, you and I both know it's one of the hardest things to actually live by. For about 2 centuries, Stoicism remained primarily a Greek philosophical school. It evolved, it developed, it attracted brilliant minds. But it was still essentially an academic pursuit, discussed in schools and porticos by people who had the luxury of time to think about such things. Then something interesting happened. Rome entered the picture. Now, you have to understand what Rome was like in the 2nd century BCE. It was hungry. Hungry for territory. Hungry for power. Hungry for culture. The Romans had conquered Greece militarily, but in a twist of irony, Greek culture conquered Rome. As the Roman poet Horace would later write, captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror. Roman aristocrats began sending their sons to study in Athens. They imported Greek philosophers to Rome. They read Greek texts and discussed Greek ideas at their dinner parties. And among all the Greek philosophies they encountered, Platonism, Epicureanism, skepticism, Stoicism found particularly fertile ground in the Roman mind. Why? Well, think about what Rome valued: duty, discipline, endurance, practical wisdom. The Romans weren't particularly interested in abstract metaphysics or ivory tower speculation. They wanted philosophy that worked. Philosophy you could use while commanding legions, governing provinces, or dealing with the intricate politics of the Senate. Stoicism offered exactly that. It was practical philosophy. It gave you tools you could actually use when your teenage son was being impossible, or when political enemies were plotting against you, or when you were dying slowly of plague on a military campaign. It didn't promise to make you happy through pleasure or wealth. It promised something the Romans found far more valuable: inner peace through virtue, regardless of external circumstances. The first prominent Roman Stoic was a man named Panetius, who came to Rome around 144 BCE. He became part of the so-called Scipionic Circle, a group of Roman nobles who were interested in Greek culture. But it was his student, Posidonius, who really began to adapt Stoicism to Roman sensibilities. Posidonius was fascinating. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was a polymath. He studied geography, astronomy, history, and mathematics. He believed philosophy should engage with the real world, with nature and society, not just abstract logic. This practical bent made Stoicism increasingly attractive to pragmatic Roman minds. But the real breakthrough came with three names you should tuck away in your mind as you drift: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. These three men, spanning about a century and a half, would define Roman Stoicism and create the works that would preserve these ideas for 2 millennia. Let's start with Seneca, because his story is complicated and human, beautifully, messily human. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born around 4 BCE in Corduba, in what's now Spain. His family was wealthy and equestrian class, which in Rome meant just below the senatorial aristocracy. He came to Rome as a young man and studied rhetoric and philosophy. He was brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious. Here's where it gets interesting. Seneca became one of Rome's most famous philosophers, writing extensively about Stoic virtue, about how we should live simply, about how wealth and power are meaningless. He wrote beautiful passages about how the wise man needs nothing, how poverty is no evil, how we should be detached from material things. And he was also, by most accounts, fantastically wealthy. He owned vast estates. He lent money at high interest rates. He lived in luxury while preaching simplicity. The irony wasn't lost on his contemporaries, and it shouldn't be lost on us either. But here's the thing, and this is important as you think about falling asleep tonight. Seneca never claimed to be a perfect Stoic sage. He was trying. He was struggling. He was writing those letters and essays to remind himself, to work through his own contradictions. Sound familiar? Seneca's life was dramatic. He was exiled by Emperor Claudius, possibly for adultery with the emperor's niece. The charges might have been false. Roman politics were vicious. He spent 8 years in Corsica, studying philosophy and writing. When Claudius's wife Agrippina took power, she recalled Seneca to Rome to tutor her young son, Nero. Ah, Nero. You probably know that name. The emperor who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. The tyrant, the monster of Roman history. And Seneca was his teacher and, for a time, his advisor. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, things were actually pretty good. This period was called the Quinquennium Neronis, and historians credit Seneca's influence for the moderate, effective governance. But power corrupts, as they say, and Nero had a lot of power. Gradually, the young emperor became more erratic, more cruel, more divorced from the Stoic principles Seneca had tried to instill. Seneca tried to withdraw from court life. He saw what was happening, but Nero wouldn't let him retire. Finally, in 65 CE, Seneca was implicated in a conspiracy against Nero. The evidence suggests he probably wasn't actually involved, but by that point, it didn't matter. Nero wanted him dead. Here's the haunting part. Seneca was ordered to commit suicide, and he did so, reportedly, with Stoic calm. According to the historian Tacitus, Seneca opened his veins, and as he died, he dictated his final thoughts to scribes. He died as he had lived, thinking, writing, teaching, trying to embody the philosophy he believed in, even if he didn't always succeed. While Seneca was navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics, there was another Stoic living a very different life. His name was Epictetus, and his story is almost the exact opposite of Seneca's. Epictetus was born around 50 CE in Hierapolis, in what's now Turkey, and he was born a slave. Think about that for a moment. One of the most influential philosophers in history, a man whose words would be studied by emperors and generals and ordinary people seeking wisdom for 2,000 years, started life as someone's property. He was owned by Epaphroditus, who was himself a freedman working for Nero. Epictetus's name literally means acquired in Greek. Even his name marked him as property. According to one story, his master once twisted his leg, and Epictetus calmly said, "You're going to break it." When the leg broke, he simply observed, "Didn't I tell you so?" Whether that story is true or not, it captures something essential about Epictetus's philosophy. He couldn't control what his master did to his body, but his mind, his will, his ability to choose his response, those remained free. This became the cornerstone of his teaching. Focus on what you can control, accept what you can't. Eventually, Epictetus was freed. We don't know exactly when or why. He studied philosophy, probably with the Stoic teacher Musonius Rufus. When Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome in 89 CE, Epictetus went to Nicopolis in Greece and opened a school. He taught there for the rest of his life, living simply, never marrying until late in life, and never writing anything down himself. Everything we know of Epictetus's teachings comes from his student Arrian, who compiled his lecture notes into 2 works, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, which means handbook. These texts are remarkably practical. Epictetus doesn't waste time on abstract theory. He's teaching people how to live, how to handle difficult family members, how to respond to illness, how to face death without fear. There's a beautiful intimacy to Epictetus's teaching. You can almost hear his voice, patient, direct, sometimes exasperated with his students. always pushing them to think harder about what really matters. And this brings us, finally, to Marcus Aurelius. Born in 121 CE, about 70 years after Epictetus, into a completely different world. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was born into one of Rome's most distinguished families. His grandfather had been consul 3 times. His father was praetor. When his father died young, he was adopted by his uncle, Antoninus Pius, who would become emperor. From childhood, Marcus was being prepared for power, but he was also, remarkably, being educated in philosophy. He studied with some of the best teachers in Rome, including Stoic philosophers. He took to philosophy with an intensity that worried his family. He wanted to sleep on the floor. He wanted to wear rough clothes. His mother had to intervene to get him to sleep in a proper bed. Imagine that, a future emperor so devoted to Stoic simplicity that his family had to pull him back from extremes. When Antoninus Pius became emperor in 138 CE, he adopted Marcus, who was 17, and another boy, Lucius Verus. The understanding was that they would rule together after Antoninus's death. For 23 years, Marcus learned statecraft, serving as consul, working closely with Antoninus, preparing for the responsibility that was coming. He never wanted it, by the way. Marcus Aurelius never wanted to be emperor. In his private writings, there's a sense of duty, of acceptance, but not of ambition or desire for power. He was a man who wanted to study philosophy, who wanted to live simply, who wanted to think about virtue and wisdom. Instead, he got one of the most difficult reigns in Roman history. Slight shift in tone, more somber. Marcus became emperor in 161 CE, sharing power with Lucius Verus as planned. Almost immediately, the Parthian Empire invaded Rome's eastern provinces. Then came plague, the Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, which would kill millions across the empire. Then Germanic tribes began pushing across the northern frontiers. Then floods. Then economic crisis. Then Lucius Verus died in 169 CE, leaving Marcus to rule alone. For most of his reign, Marcus Aurelius was at war. Not because he wanted to be, not because he sought glory or conquest, but because the empire he inherited was under attack from multiple directions. He spent years on campaign, living in military camps, dealing with freezing winters along the Danube, watching soldiers and civilians die of plague. And in those military camps, by candlelight, he wrote. He wrote in Greek, not Latin, probably because Greek was the language of philosophy. He wrote in a private journal, never intending anyone else to read his words. He didn't even give it a title. We call it Meditations, but Marcus probably just thought of it as notes to himself. And what did the most powerful man in the world write about? He reminded himself to be kind, to be patient, to remember that everyone is doing their best with what they understand. He reminded himself that anger is pointless, that death is natural, that the opinions of others don't define him, that virtue is the only true good. He reminded himself of the Stoic principles his teachers had taught him, principles he struggled to live up to, just like Seneca before him, just like all of us. Here's one of my favorite passages from Marcus's Meditations, and you should hear it tonight as you're settling into sleep. He writes, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. Now, that sounds pretty pessimistic at first, doesn't it? But listen to what comes next. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. Do you see what he's doing? He's preparing himself for difficulty, yes, but he's also reminding himself of connection, of shared humanity. He's telling himself that even difficult people deserve patience because they're struggling with the same fundamental questions we all are. This was not just philosophy from Marcus Aurelius. This was survival. This was how he made it through years of war, plague, betrayal, and the grinding weight of responsibility. He had trusted advisors who betrayed him. He had a wife, Faustina, who was rumored, probably falsely, to be unfaithful. He had a son, Commodus, who would become one of Rome's worst emperors, undoing much of Marcus's careful work. He suffered from chronic illness, possibly stomach ulcers. He was in pain, often physically and certainly emotionally. And yet, he kept writing reminders to himself about virtue, about kindness, about acceptance. You know what's remarkable? Marcus Aurelius had every reason to become bitter. He could have indulged in absolute power, taken out his frustrations on others, lived in luxury and excess as compensation for his difficulties. Nobody could have stopped him. He was emperor. Instead, he chose to be just. He chose to be merciful when he could. He chose to work for the welfare of his people, even when it cost him personally. He chose to keep studying philosophy, keep examining himself, keep trying to be better. Was he perfect? No. He persecuted Christians, which by modern standards is horrifying, though in his context, he probably saw them as a threat to social order. He made political mistakes. He failed to prevent his son Commodus from eventually taking power, despite probably knowing Commodus wasn't suitable for it. But he tried, day after day, year after year, in those cold military camps and in the palace in Rome. He tried to live according to his principles. And here's the thing. The secret, really, that Marcus Aurelius and the other Stoic emperors kept. It wasn't that they had some special wisdom that made life easy. It wasn't that they had achieved some perfect peace that lifted them above human suffering. The secret was simpler and harder than that. The secret was that they were just people, like you, like me, trying to figure out how to live well in difficult circumstances. They struggled with the same things we struggle with: anger, fear, disappointment, the challenge of being kind when you're tired, the challenge of staying true to your values when it would be easier not to. The difference was that they wrote it down. They practiced it deliberately. They created a framework for thinking about these challenges that helped them respond better, live better, suffer less from their own minds. And they kept it relatively quiet, not because it was forbidden or dangerous in itself, but because it showed vulnerability. It showed that even emperors doubted themselves, struggled with emotions, needed reminders to be good. In a world where imperial power depended partly on an image of divine authority and supreme confidence, this private struggle for virtue was, in a way, a secret. When you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, you're reading something intensely personal. You're reading a man talking to himself, coaching himself through difficult days, reminding himself of what matters. The fact that these private writings survived at all is somewhat miraculous. They were discovered centuries after his death. These personal notes never meant for publication. And when people read them, they recognized something true, something that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. That philosophy isn't about having all the answers or being better than other people. It's about the daily practice of trying to live well, of trying to be good, of accepting what you can't change and changing what you can. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, you can take comfort in this. The most powerful people in history struggled just like you do. They lay awake at night worried about their children. They felt frustrated by people who didn't understand them. They faced loss and illness and disappointment. They got angry when they didn't want to. They said things they regretted. They failed at their own ideals more often than they succeeded. And yet, they kept trying. They kept practicing. They kept reminding themselves of what mattered. The Stoic secret the Roman emperors tried to hide wasn't really a secret at all. It was simply this: we're all in this together, struggling to make sense of life, to respond well to difficulty, to find peace in uncertain times. The practice never ends. The struggle is universal, and there's something beautiful in that shared human experience. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, probably of plague, in a military camp along the Danube, the same place where he'd written so much of his meditations. He was 58 years old. He'd been emperor for 19 years, spending most of them at war, watching the world he knew slowly fragmenting. But he died having tried his best to live according to his principles. He died having written words that would comfort and guide people 2,000 years later. He died having kept that secret that emperors are human too, safe in his private writings. Until those writings were found, until we discovered that the most powerful man in the world had been, all along, just a person trying to be good. Just like Seneca, struggling with his own contradictions. Just like Epictetus, maintaining inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. And in discovering their secret, we discovered something precious. Permission to struggle, permission to try and fail and try again, permission to be human while still striving for virtue. That's the real Stoic secret. And now you know it too. Rest well. Tomorrow is another day to practice. The hidden practices and forgotten stories. Details and unknown facts. The emperor's private world. Now, you might think that's the whole story. 3 philosophers, 1 wealthy advisor, 1 former slave, 1 reluctant emperor, all teaching the same basic ideas about control, virtue, and acceptance. But as you lie there tonight, let me tell you about the parts of the story that don't usually get told. The strange details, the mysteries, the practices they kept private, even from most of their students. Because here's something interesting. The Stoics weren't just philosophers. They were, in their own way, practitioners of a kind of ancient psychological technology. They had specific exercises, daily practices, mental techniques that they used to reshape how their minds worked. And some of these practices were, well, let's just say they were unusual enough that they kept them relatively quiet. Let's start with something that would surprise most people about Marcus Aurelius. You remember him from earlier, the philosopher-emperor, writing noble thoughts in his military tent. But did you know that Marcus Aurelius may have been addicted to opium? It's true. Well, probably true. The historical evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Marcus took a daily medicine called theriac, which was a sort of cure-all mixture that contained opium among many other ingredients. His physician, Galen, one of the most famous doctors in history, prescribed it for him, likely for chronic pain. Marcus mentioned suffering from chest and stomach ailments throughout his life. Here's where it gets interesting. Galen's writings mention that when Marcus tried to reduce his dose of theriac, he couldn't sleep. He experienced what we would now recognize as withdrawal symptoms. Eventually, they settled on a regular daily dose that Marcus took, apparently, for years. So the philosopher who wrote about self-control and virtue was, quite possibly, chemically dependent on a substance. Does this undermine his philosophy? Make him a hypocrite? Actually, it makes him more human, more real. He was managing chronic pain the best way he knew how, with the medical knowledge available to him. And still, despite physical dependence, despite pain, despite the fog that opium can create, he kept practicing his philosophy. He kept trying to be just, to be patient, to be good. There's something oddly comforting in that, isn't there? But the opium is just the beginning of the lesser-known details. Let me tell you about the Stoic practices that sound almost like ancient cognitive behavioral therapy, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every morning, they would imagine everything that could go wrong that day. Your friend might betray you. You might get sick. Someone might insult you. You might lose your money. You might die. Sounds depressing, doesn't it? Like a recipe for anxiety. But here's the trick. They weren't dwelling on these possibilities to torture themselves. They were rehearsing their responses. They were removing the shock value from misfortune. Remember that passage from Marcus Aurelius I mentioned earlier about waking up and knowing people would be difficult? That was premeditatio malorum in action. By morning, he'd already mentally prepared for every annoying thing that might happen. So when it did happen, when someone was rude, when plans fell through, his mind had already processed it. The emotional impact was blunted. Modern psychology has rediscovered this technique. It's called defensive pessimism or sometimes stress inoculation. Athletes use it. Therapists teach it. The Stoics were doing it 2,000 years ago, sitting in their morning quiet, systematically imagining disaster. Epictetus taught his students to practice this constantly. He'd tell them, when you kiss your child goodnight, whisper to yourself, tomorrow, you may be dead. When you say goodbye to your wife, remind yourself this might be the last time you see her. Morbid? Maybe. But Epictetus had a point. He wasn't trying to make people sad. He was trying to make them present, to help them appreciate what they had while they had it, to prepare them for the inevitable losses that life brings. Here's another practice you might not know about. The Stoics regularly practiced poverty. Even wealthy ones like Seneca. They would periodically eat only bread and water, sleep on the floor, wear their worst clothes. They'd live like the poor for a few days, sometimes longer. Why? 2 reasons. First, to practice for loss. If you might lose everything tomorrow, better to know you can survive it. Better to learn now that poverty isn't as terrifying as you imagine. Second, to make everything else taste better. Return to your normal life after a few days of bread and water, and suddenly your simple dinner seems like a feast. Seneca wrote about this practice in his letters to Lucilius. He described eating coarse bread, sleeping on a hard bed, and finding that he actually felt fine. Content, even. He wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" The irony, of course, is that Seneca was writing this from one of his multiple luxurious villas. He owned estates across Italy. His wealth was notorious, and yet he genuinely seemed to practice voluntary discomfort. Maybe it was hypocrisy, or maybe it was a wealthy man trying, imperfectly, to maintain perspective, to remember that all his luxury was temporary, that he could lose it all and survive. Which interpretation you choose says more about you than about Seneca, perhaps. Let me tell you something else most people don't know. Marcus Aurelius almost certainly never intended anyone to read his meditations. And that's not just because they were private journals. It's because of what's actually in them. If you sit down and read the meditation straight through, you'll notice something odd. Marcus repeats himself a lot. The same themes come up again and again. Death is natural. Don't be angry. Other people's opinions don't matter. Everything is temporary. Focus on virtue. It's not organized like a book meant for readers. It's not building an argument or developing ideas systematically. It's more like therapy notes, or mantras, or a man reminding himself of the same truths over and over because he kept forgetting them. And here's the poignant part. Marcus was writing many of these reminders during the worst period of his life. The campaigns along the Danube, the years of plague, watching his soldiers die, being away from home, dealing with constant military emergencies. He was writing to keep himself sane, to keep himself decent, to prevent the darkness of his circumstances from consuming him. There are passages where you can feel his exhaustion. Book 10, Passage 10, How Strangely Men Act. They will not praise those who are living at the same time and living with themselves, but to be themselves praised by posterity, by those whom they have never seen or ever will see. This they set much value on. You can hear the weariness there, can't you? The frustration with human vanity, including probably his own, the longing for simplicity, the weight of dealing with people's ambitions and pettiness while trying to hold an empire together. Here's a mystery for you. There are references in ancient sources to other works by Marcus Aurelius that have been lost. Letters, possibly other philosophical writings. What happened to them? Some scholars think they were deliberately destroyed or suppressed, possibly by his son Commodus, who had no interest in philosophy and may have wanted to bury evidence of how disappointed Marcus had been in him. Others think they simply decayed or were lost in the chaos of later centuries. But imagine what might be in those lost texts. More personal reflections, perhaps more criticism of Roman society, maybe even doubts about Stoicism itself, moments when the philosophy didn't seem to be working, when Marcus felt overwhelmed despite all his training. We'll never know. Those texts are gone, dissolved into time like so many ancient writings. The meditations survived almost by accident, copied, preserved, passed down through generations who recognized something valuable in this emperor's private struggles. Speaking of lost texts, let's talk about Epictetus for a moment. Remember, he never wrote anything himself. Everything we have comes from his student Arrian's lecture notes. But here's what's haunting. Arrian's notes are themselves incomplete. He compiled 8 books of discourses, but only 4 survive. Half of Epictetus's teachings are simply gone. What was in those lost books? What questions did students ask that we'll never hear the answers to? What stories did Epictetus tell that have vanished? There's a beautiful melancholy in this, isn't there? The idea that so much wisdom, so many insights into human nature and how to live well, has simply evaporated. All we have are fragments, pieces, enough to change lives, apparently, but still just pieces of a larger whole. Let me tell you about something that rarely gets discussed: the Stoics' complicated relationship with emotions. Popular culture has gotten this almost completely wrong. People think Stoic means emotionless, cold, detached. But that's not what the ancient Stoics taught at all. The Stoics divided emotions into 2 categories. There were unhealthy emotions, what they called passions, which were based on false judgments. Anger at something you can't control. Fear of something that isn't truly bad. Desire for something that won't actually help you. These, they said, you should work to eliminate. But then there were healthy emotional responses, what they called good feelings. Joy at virtue. Caution about real dangers. A wish for good things. These were fine, natural, human. The difference was about judgment and control. Anger because someone cut you off in traffic? Unhealthy. It's based on the false judgment that this minor inconvenience is actually terrible, and it's about something you can't change. Sadness because a loved one died. Complex. The Stoics acknowledged this was natural, but said that excessive grief came from false judgments about death being evil rather than natural. It sounds cold when stated that way, but in practice, when you read what they actually wrote, there's real emotional depth there. Marcus Aurelius wrote movingly about the death of his tutor, in the submission which he showed to his friends and his grateful attachment to them. He clearly loved his teachers, felt gratitude, experienced connection. Seneca wrote beautiful letters about friendship, about how much joy we can find in genuine connection with others. Epictetus acknowledged that we naturally feel affection for our children, and that's appropriate. We just shouldn't let that affection become anxious attachment that causes us suffering. Here's something else. Seneca the Younger had a brother you probably haven't heard of. His name was Gallio, and he appears briefly in the Bible. He was the Roman governor who dismissed charges against Paul in Corinth, basically saying it was a religious dispute he didn't care about. But there's a deeper story here. Gallio was, by some accounts, an even more beloved figure than Seneca. He was known for his gentle temperament, his kindness. But in 65 CE, the same year Seneca was forced to commit suicide, Gallio was also killed on Nero's orders. The entire family, one of Rome's most distinguished philosophical lineages, essentially destroyed in Nero's paranoid purges. Imagine being Seneca in those final moments, knowing your brother would likely be next, knowing that all your years of trying to moderate Nero, to instill virtue in him, had failed so catastrophically. How do you practice Stoic acceptance in that moment? How do you maintain equanimity when your family line is being extinguished? The sources say Seneca died calmly, philosophically, but the sources weren't in his head. They didn't feel what he felt. They just saw the external performance of calm. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what Stoic practice really is, not eliminating feeling, but choosing how to act regardless of feeling. Being terrified but acting courageously. Feeling grief but not being destroyed by it. Experiencing anger, but not letting it control your behavior. Let me tell you about the Stoic practice of objective representation, seeing things as they truly are, stripped of the judgments we layer onto them. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly in his meditations. He described things in deliberately plain, even reductive terms. Wine, the juice of a grape, purple robes, sheep's wool dyed with shellfish blood, sexual intercourse. He has a rather clinical description I won't repeat fully, but it involves friction and a spasm. Why this practice? Because we make ourselves miserable by adding layers of meaning to neutral things. We see a luxury item and think, I must have that to be happy. We see someone's success and think, that diminishes me. We see our own aging and think, this is terrible. But strip away the judgments, and what do you have? Sheep's wool, someone doing their work. Your body changing as all bodies do. It sounds cynical, but it's actually liberating. It's a way of breaking the spell that desires and fears cast over us. It's a way of seeing clearly. Marcus would do this with even the most respected things. The Roman triumph, that great ceremony where victorious generals paraded through Rome. He reminded himself it was dust and a play, fame and glory, an echo, death, a natural process like youth or old age. Not to make these things meaningless, but to restore their proper scale, to stop being controlled by them. Here's something strange. There are hints in the historical record that some Stoics practiced a form of meditation that sounds remarkably like what we'd now call mindfulness. They would sit quietly, observe their thoughts without attachment, focus on their breathing. Epictetus talks about watching your impressions as they arise, not immediately accepting them, but examining them, almost like a scientist observing specimens. An impression comes, examine it before you accept it. Ask, is this something within my control or not? If not within my control, be ready to say, it is nothing to me. This is cognitive distancing. It's metacognition. It's exactly what modern mindfulness teachers instruct people to do. Watch your thoughts without being caught up in them. The Stoics called it prosoke, attention, awareness, concentration. Some scholars think the Stoics may have borrowed meditation practices from Eastern philosophy, possibly through Greek contact with Buddhist traditions after Alexander's conquest brought the Mediterranean world into contact with India. Others think they developed these practices independently. Either way, it's fascinating. The Emperor of Rome, sitting in his tent, watching his thoughts arise and pass away, trying to maintain that witnessing consciousness that doesn't identify with every passing mental event. 2,000 years before apps and guided meditations, they were doing essentially the same practice. Let me tell you something that will make you smile. Marcus Aurelius kept a philosophical journal, as we know. But do you know what else he did? He wrote thank you notes. Lots of them. Elaborately grateful thank you notes to everyone who had influenced him. The entire first book of his meditations is basically one long gratitude list. From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and the government of my temper. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. He goes on like this for pages, thanking his tutors for teaching him to not pick sides in chariot races, thanking his adoptive father for showing him how to govern with clemency, thanking the gods for giving him good teachers and a good family. It's endearing, honestly. This powerful emperor, sitting down to write his private thoughts, and he starts with gratitude, with acknowledging everyone who helped him become who he was. This wasn't just politeness. It was a deliberate Stoic practice. Gratitude was a way of recognizing that we don't achieve anything alone, that we're all supported by countless others, living and dead, who gave us opportunities, taught us skills, showed us examples. It was also a way of staying humble. Hard to feel superior when you're constantly reminding yourself how much you owe to others. Modern psychology has, again, rediscovered this. Gratitude journals, gratitude practices, they improve mental health, increase happiness, build resilience. The Stoics knew this 2 millennia ago. Here's a detail about Epictetus that rarely gets mentioned. He was physically disabled. That broken leg from his slave days, it never healed properly. He walked with a limp, possibly needed a cane or crutch. Some sources suggest he was quite frail physically. And yet this man, who had been enslaved, who was physically limited, who had experienced firsthand the absolute bottom of Roman society, taught that no one could truly harm you unless you let them, that your body might be constrained, but your mind and will could be absolutely free. He lived that teaching. His disability couldn't imprison his mind. His past couldn't define his present. His physical limitations didn't limit his philosophical reach. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but beautiful, that when a wealthy student complained about his uncomfortable living conditions, Epictetus gestured to his own simple, disabled body and said essentially, "I live in this, and I'm free. What's your excuse? Let me tell you about a mystery that has puzzled historians. Why did Marcus Aurelius write in Greek rather than Latin? He was Roman emperor. Latin was the language of power, of law, of governance. Yet his most personal thoughts are in Greek. Some scholars say it's simply because Greek was the language of philosophy. If you were doing serious philosophical work, you did it in Greek, the same way scientists until recently did their work in Latin, or how academics now default to English. But there's another possibility. Maybe Marcus chose Greek precisely because it was a private language. His Greek was excellent, but it wasn't the language of his court, his soldiers, his everyday governance. Writing in Greek created distance. It marked these thoughts as separate from his public imperial identity. In Greek, he wasn't Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He was just Marcus, or even just you, because he addresses himself directly throughout. You've been given these circumstances. Now what will you do with them? Writing in Greek might have been a way of accessing a different part of himself. The part that wasn't emperor. The part that was just a human being trying to figure out how to live. Here's something that will change how you think about these philosophers. They all struggled with insomnia. We know this because they all wrote about it. Seneca wrote extensively about sleeplessness, about lying awake worrying, about the mind racing with anxieties. He recommended getting up rather than lying there suffering, going for a walk, reading philosophy, doing something productive until sleep came naturally. Marcus Aurelius references his sleep problems indirectly. Many passages in the Meditations seem to be written to help himself get back to sleep, reminding himself that whatever he's worried about isn't as important as it seems, that tomorrow will come whether he sleeps or not, that worrying is pointless. Epictetus taught his students specific practices for dealing with sleeplessness. When you can't sleep, examine what you're worried about. Is it in your control? If not, why are you worrying? If yes, make a plan for tomorrow and let it go for now. It's weirdly comforting, isn't it? These great philosophers, celebrated for their wisdom and equanimity, lying awake at night just like you sometimes do, trying to quiet their minds, trying to stop worrying, trying to just rest. They were dealing with the same anxious human brain that you deal with, the same tendency to catastrophize at 3 a.m., the same difficulty letting go. And their solutions? Essentially cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, examining anxious thoughts, reality testing fears, creating distance from worries, practicing acceptance. 2,000 years ago, lying awake in the darkness, they were developing techniques that therapists now teach as cutting-edge treatment. Let me tell you about the women, because this is a story I've been telling about men: Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. But there were women practicing Stoicism too, and their stories have been largely erased from history. We know there were female Stoics. Musonius Rufus, who taught Epictetus, wrote an entire treatise arguing that women should study philosophy and could do so just as effectively as men. He taught female students, which was unusual for his time. Portia Catonis was a Stoic philosopher, daughter of Cato the Younger, a famous Stoic, and wife of Brutus. Yes, that Brutus. According to sources, she was deeply educated in Stoic philosophy and practiced it with such dedication that when her husband was plotting against Caesar, she proved her trustworthiness by stabbing herself in the thigh to show she could endure pain without revealing secrets. That's intense, possibly too intense, and possibly exaggerated by Roman historians who love dramatic stories. But it suggests women were practicing Stoicism seriously, rigorously. Marcus Aurelius's mother, Domitia Lucilla, was apparently well-educated and may have had Stoic leanings. In the Meditations, Marcus thanks her for teaching him religious devotion and simplicity of life, both Stoic values. But we don't have their writings. We don't have their perspectives. We don't know what Stoicism looked like through their eyes, shaped by their experiences of Roman society as women. What would a female Epictetus have written? What would a female Marcus Aurelius have meditated on? How would the practice of focusing on what you can control look different for someone who had, legally and socially, much less control? We'll never know. Their voices are lost. And that's one of history's great tragedies. All the wisdom, all the perspectives, all the insights that have simply vanished because the people who had them weren't in positions where their words would be preserved. Here's an odd detail. Marcus Aurelius had a thing about gladiators, but not in the way most Romans did. He famously disliked gladiatorial games. He found them barbaric, boring, repetitive. When he was required to attend, which was often, as emperor, he would bring his work and read or conduct business, pointedly ignoring the violence in the arena. This actually made him unpopular with some Romans who loved their blood sports and thought the emperor should at least pretend to enjoy them. But here's the twist. Marcus did order gladiators to fight with blunted weapons sometimes, to reduce deaths. He tried to make the games less lethal, and his tutor, Junius Rusticus, gave him a book that apparently shaped his thinking about the games, a book that emphasized the humanity of gladiators, the waste of their deaths. So the Stoic emperor, who wrote about accepting fate and not being disturbed by things outside his control, actually tried to control this. He tried to make things better within the constraints of his power. It's a reminder that Stoic acceptance doesn't mean passive resignation. It means working to change what you can while accepting what you can't. Marcus couldn't abolish the games. Roman society wouldn't have tolerated it, and he needed the political capital for other things. But he could blunt the weapons, save some lives, make it marginally less awful. Imperfect? Yes, but maybe that's the point. Maybe real-world ethics is always imperfect, always compromised, always about doing what good you can in the circumstances you're actually in. Let me leave you with one more mystery, something to contemplate as you drift towards sleep. There's a passage in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations where he writes about the interconnectedness of everything, about how we're all part of a larger whole, like cells in a body. He writes about the logos, the rational principle that organizes the universe. And then he writes, all things are implicated with one another, and the bond is holy. That phrase, the bond is holy. What did he mean? Was this metaphor? Religious belief? Mystical experience? Scientific observation about causality and interdependence? Marcus was writing this in a tent, on campaign, probably exhausted, possibly in pain, definitely worried about his empire. And in that moment, he perceived something, a connection, a pattern, a unity beneath the chaos. Was he right? Is there a bond? Is it holy? Or was he just a tired man trying to find meaning and comfort in difficult circumstances, reaching for philosophical concepts that helped him feel less alone? Does it matter? Because whether the bond is objectively, metaphysically real, or just a useful way of thinking about the world, it helped him. It helps people still. The idea that we're connected, that what we do matters, that there's meaning in struggling to be good, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching. That's the real secret, maybe. Not some hidden Stoic doctrine, not some lost practice. Just this, the choice to find meaning, the decision to keep trying, the practice of being decent in indecent times. The emperor knew this. The slave knew this. The wealthy senator knew this. And now, as you settle into sleep, you know it too. Gentle fade. Rest now. Let these stories work in your mind. Let these long-dead philosophers keep you company in the dark. They understood insomnia, anxiety, the challenge of being human. They'd want you to sleep well. Section 3. Echoes through time. Influence and legacy. The philosophy that wouldn't die. You know what's strange about ideas? The really good ones refuse to die. They hide, sometimes for centuries. They transform. They appear in unexpected places wearing different clothes. But they persist, like water finding its way through rock, eventually reaching the sea. Tonight, as you settle deeper into comfort, let me tell you what happened to that Stoic secret after the emperors were gone. Because the story doesn't end with Marcus Aurelius dying in his military camp in 180 CE. In some ways, that's where the really interesting part begins. When Marcus Aurelius died, his son Commodus became emperor. Remember Commodus? The one Marcus had worried about, the one who would undo so much of his father's work? Commodus had zero interest in philosophy. He wanted to be a gladiator, actually fought in the arena himself, which scandalized the aristocracy. He renamed Rome after himself. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules. It was not what his Stoic father had hoped for. Commodus's reign lasted 12 years before he was assassinated, and with him died the last direct connection to the Stoic emperors. The empire entered a period of chaos, the crisis of the 3rd century, when dozens of emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Civil wars, economic collapse, barbarian invasions, plague. Everything Marcus Aurelius had worked to prevent seemed to be happening anyway. And in this chaos, you might think Stoicism would have died out. The philosophy of emperors made irrelevant by the end of stable imperial rule. But that's not what happened. Instead, Stoicism went underground. Not dramatically. There was no persecution of philosophers, no burning of books. It just became less fashionable, less prominent. The great public teachers were gone. The imperial patronage vanished. The schools continued, but smaller, quieter, less influential. And yet, the ideas persisted. They persisted because they worked. Because when everything is falling apart around you, when your civilization seems to be crumbling, when certainty evaporates, when the future looks dark, the Stoic toolkit is incredibly useful. Focus on what you can control. Accept what you can't. Practice virtue regardless of outcome. Find meaning in right action, not in results you can't guarantee. These ideas don't require prosperity. They don't require stability. In fact, they're most useful when things are falling apart. So Stoicism lived on in the minds of people trying to navigate the collapse of the world they knew. It lived on in letters and books and teachings passed from teacher to student. It lived on in the practical ethics of people trying to live decently in indecent times. And then something unexpected happened. Christianity arrived. Now, you might think Christianity and Stoicism would be enemies. One is a religion about faith, salvation, and a personal God. The other is a philosophy about reason, virtue, and an impersonal cosmic order. They seem incompatible, but look closer. Look at the overlap. The Stoics taught universal human brotherhood. We're all part of the same rational order, all deserving of respect and compassion. Christianity taught the same. We're all children of God, all equal in His eyes. The Stoics taught that virtue is its own reward, that you should do good regardless of external outcomes. Christianity taught that righteousness matters more than worldly success, that your moral character is what counts. The Stoics taught acceptance of fate as part of a divine plan. Christianity taught submission to God's will. The Stoics practiced contemplation, self-examination, and the constant effort to improve oneself. Christianity taught prayer, confession, and the struggle against sin. See the pattern? Early Christian thinkers noticed it too. They started incorporating Stoic ideas into Christian theology. Not explicitly. They weren't going to cite pagan philosophers in their sermons. But the concepts seeped in. The vocabulary, the practices. St. Paul, writing in the 1st century, used Stoic terminology. When he talked about self-sufficiency and contentment in all circumstances, he was echoing Epictetus. When he wrote about examining yourself and controlling your passions, he was channeling ideas the Stoics had been teaching for centuries. The early Christian philosopher Justin Martyr explicitly praised the Stoics. He said they had glimpsed truth through reason, even if they didn't have the full revelation of Christ. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian thinkers in history, was educated in Stoic philosophy before his conversion. His ideas about the will, about sin as a kind of error in judgment, about the inner struggle toward virtue, all of this has Stoic fingerprints on it. So Stoicism didn't die. It transformed. It became part of the intellectual DNA of medieval Christianity. Monks in their cells, practicing contemplation and self-denial, were doing something not so different from what Seneca recommended with his voluntary poverty exercises. Christian mystics, examining their consciences and cataloging their failings, were doing the kind of self-scrutiny that Marcus Aurelius practiced nightly. The Stoic emphasis on controlling your reactions, on not being disturbed by external events. This became Christian equanimity, the peace that passes understanding. The Stoic idea that death is nothing to fear became the Christian hope for eternal life. The Stoic practice of seeing yourself as part of a larger cosmic order became Christian submission to divine providence. Different words, different framework, but similar practices, similar goals, similar psychological techniques. And here's the beautiful irony. The philosophy developed by pagans, by men who lived centuries before Christ, helped shape the religion that would define Western civilization for a millennium and a half. Marcus Aurelius, who persecuted Christians without really understanding what they believed, inadvertently contributed to the tradition that would eventually replace his pagan worldview. History has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Let me tell you about Boethius. It's the year 524 CE, and you're in a prison cell in Pavia, Italy. The Western Roman Empire has fallen. Rome itself was sacked more than a century ago. Germanic kingdoms now rule what used to be imperial provinces. The classical world is ending. Your name is Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, Boethius for short, and you used to be powerful. You were a senator, a consul, an advisor to the Gothic King Theodoric. You translated Greek philosophy into Latin. You were one of the last scholars who could still read Greek, one of the last links to the classical intellectual tradition. And now you're in prison, falsely accused of treason, awaiting execution. What do? You write a book. You write The Consolation of Philosophy, and it becomes one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages. For 1,000 years, it's one of the most widely read texts in Europe, translated into every major language, studied by kings and scholars and common readers. And what is it? It's essentially a Stoic handbook, wrapped in Christian-compatible language, written by a man facing death. In your book, philosophy appears to you as a woman and reminds you of everything the Stoics taught. Fortune is fickle. You can't control external events. Your true good lies in virtue, in your character, not in wealth or power or even life itself. You should focus on what's eternal and real, not what's temporary and illusory. It's Marcus Aurelius, essentially. It's Epictetus, but written for a Christian world by a Christian author in a way that made these ideas acceptable and accessible to medieval readers. You die shortly after finishing the book, executed, probably brutally, but your book lives on. It comforts prisoners and kings. It guides scholars and laypeople. It keeps Stoic ideas alive through the Dark Ages, even though most medieval readers didn't realize they were learning Stoicism. They just knew it worked. It helped them deal with suffering. It gave them perspective. It made life bearable. Fast forward now. It's the 15th and 16th centuries. The Renaissance. Scholars are rediscovering classical texts that had been lost or forgotten for centuries. Greek manuscripts are flowing into Italy from Constantinople after the fall of the Byzantine Empire. People are reading the ancient authors in their original languages again. And suddenly, Stoicism is back. Not hidden in Christian theology anymore, but explicit. Scholars are reading Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius in the original Latin and Greek. They're translating these works into vernacular languages. They're getting excited about what they find. Because here's what they discover. These ancient pagans had developed a sophisticated ethical system that didn't require revelation or faith. It was based on reason, on observation of human nature, on practical techniques for living well. This is exciting and dangerous in equal measure. The church isn't sure what to make of it. On one hand, these are pagan authors. On the other hand, their ethics are mostly compatible with Christian virtue. And honestly, they're often more practical and psychologically sophisticated than medieval Christian moral theology. Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, loved Seneca. He published an edition of Seneca's works and praised his moral wisdom. Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, read Seneca and Epictetus obsessively. His essays are soaked in Stoic ideas, though filtered through his own skeptical, humane perspective. Justus Lipsius, a Flemish scholar, tried to create a Christian Stoicism, Neo-Stoicism, he called it. He wrote books arguing that you could be a good Christian and practice Stoic philosophy, that the two were compatible, even complementary. And people read these works. Educated Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries were steeped in Stoic ideas. They read Seneca for moral instruction. They read Epictetus for practical wisdom. They read Marcus Aurelius when his meditations were finally published in the late 16th century. Here's something amusing. Marcus Aurelius's meditations almost didn't survive at all. Remember, he never intended them for publication. They were private notes. After his death, they were preserved somehow, maybe by family members, maybe by loyal friends, but they weren't widely circulated. For over 1,000 years, very few people knew this text existed. A few Byzantine scholars mentioned it. A handful of manuscript copies circulated in monasteries, but it was obscure, forgotten. Then, in 1558, someone published the first printed edition, and slowly, very slowly, it found its audience. By the 17th century, it was being translated into modern languages. By the 18th century, it was recognized as a masterpiece. Think about that. One of the most influential philosophical texts in history was almost lost. The private journal of an ancient emperor, gathering dust in libraries for over a millennium, one fire or one careless librarian away from disappearing forever. But it survived, and when people finally read it, they recognized something true, something useful, something that spoke to them across the centuries. Let me tell you about the Enlightenment. It's the 17th and 18th centuries now, and Europe is changing. Science is developing. Reason is being celebrated. Traditional religious authority is being questioned. Philosophers are trying to figure out how to live ethically without relying solely on religious doctrine. And where do they turn? Back to the Stoics, among others. René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, was deeply influenced by Stoicism. His emphasis on reason, on clarity of thought, on distinguishing what you can know from what you merely believe. This has Stoic roots. His famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am," is about finding certainty by turning inward, by examining consciousness itself. The Stoics would have approved. Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, developed a system that's essentially Stoicism in geometric form. He argued that understanding the necessity of all events leads to peace of mind, that we should accept what must be and not rail against reality. That virtue is its own reward and consists in understanding and accepting the natural order. His contemporaries called him an atheist, but really, he was reviving the Stoic idea of a rational, orderly universe that operates according to fixed principles. He just called it nature or God, and he made it philosophically rigorous in a way that appealed to the scientific mindset of his age. The Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, David Hume, Adam Smith, were steeped in Stoic ethics. Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which preceded his more famous Wealth of Nations, is heavily influenced by Stoic ideas about virtue and the importance of self-command. Even the American founding fathers read the Stoics. George Washington kept a copy of Seneca's plays. Thomas Jefferson had Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius in his library. The Roman Republican virtue they admired was Stoic virtue: duty, self-control, commitment to the common good over private interest. But here's what's fascinating. By this point, Stoicism had become so embedded in Western thought that people didn't always realize where these ideas came from. They just seemed like common sense, like wisdom that had always been there. The idea that you should focus on what you can control? Obvious. The idea that virtue matters more than external success? Basic morality. The idea that accepting reality rather than fighting it brings peace? Simple wisdom. But these ideas weren't obvious to everyone throughout history. They were developed, refined, practiced, and transmitted by specific people in specific contexts. By Zeno in his painted porch, by Epictetus in his lectures, by Marcus in his military tent, by Boethius in his prison cell, by Renaissance scholars in their studies, by Enlightenment philosophers in their treatises. Each generation rediscovered these ideas and found them useful. Each generation translated them into their own language, adapted them to their own circumstances, made them work for their own challenges. And the ideas survived precisely because they were useful, not just theoretically interesting, but practically valuable. They help people live better, suffer less, find meaning, maintain dignity. Now let's jump to the 20th century, the modern era. You'd think Stoicism would be obsolete by now, right? We have psychology, we have therapy, we have medication for anxiety and depression, we have self-help books and life coaches and wellness apps. We don't need ancient philosophy anymore, do we? And yet, in the mid-20th century, something remarkable happened. A psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps. He watched his fellow prisoners, observed who survived and who gave up, tried to understand what made the difference. After the war, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and in it, he describes a realization he had in the camps. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Do you recognize that? It's pure Stoicism. It's Epictetus, the former slave, teaching that your mind remains free even when your body is imprisoned. It's Marcus Aurelius, reminding himself that no one can force him to react in any particular way. Frankl didn't discover something new. He rediscovered something ancient, and he used it to develop logotherapy, a therapeutic approach focused on finding meaning even in suffering. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, psychologists started developing cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The core idea? Your thoughts create your emotions. Change your thoughts, change your feelings. Examine your automatic beliefs. Challenge unhelpful thinking patterns. Focus on what you can control. Sound familiar? It's Stoicism. It's the Stoic practice of examining your judgments, recognizing that events themselves aren't good or bad. Your interpretations make them so. It's premeditatio malorum. It's objective representation. It's all the techniques we talked about earlier. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, the founders of CBT, weren't explicitly working from Stoic texts. They were empirical researchers, developing treatments based on what worked. But they ended up recreating, in modern psychological language, the same techniques the Stoics had developed 2,000 years earlier. Because human psychology hasn't changed, the problems we face, anxiety, depression, anger, fear, loss, these are the same problems humans have always faced. And the solutions the Stoics developed, they still work. Let me tell you about James Stockdale. It's 1965, and you're a Navy pilot shot down over Vietnam. You're captured. You spend the next 7 years as a prisoner of war, much of it in solitary confinement, enduring torture and abuse. What gets you through? Before you were shot down, you had studied philosophy. You had read Epictetus. And in that prison camp, you remembered what you'd learned. You practiced Stoic techniques. You focused on what you could control, your reactions, your thoughts, your integrity, and accepted what you couldn't. You created a communication system with other prisoners by tapping on walls, using a code based on the alphabet. You couldn't control your captivity, but you could control your response. You could maintain dignity. You could support your fellow prisoners. You could refuse to be broken. After the war, James Stockdale wrote about how Stoicism saved him. He titled one of his books, Courage Under Fire, testing Epictetus's doctrines in a laboratory of human behavior. The laboratory of human behavior. That's what a torture chamber became for him. A place to test whether ancient philosophy actually worked under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And his conclusion? It worked. Epictetus, the former slave, speaking across 2,000 years to a prisoner in Vietnam, telling him that his captors controlled his body but not his will, that he could maintain his character even when everything else was stripped away. That virtue and dignity came from within, not from external circumstances. And it was true. Stockdale survived, maintained his sanity, kept his integrity, came home, and lived a full life. That's the legacy of Stoicism. Not abstract theory, not intellectual games, but practical wisdom that helps real people survive real suffering. Here we are now, in the 21st century, and Stoicism is having another renaissance. Books about Stoicism are bestsellers. Podcasts discuss Stoic principles. Apps offer daily Stoic meditations. People are reading Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius again, finding them surprisingly relevant. Why now? Maybe because we live in uncertain times again. political chaos, climate anxiety, economic instability, the rapid pace of technological change, the overwhelming flood of information, the sense that things are out of control. These are the conditions that make Stoicism useful. When the world feels chaotic, the Stoic toolkit helps. Focus on what you can control, let go of what you can't. When anxiety threatens to overwhelm you, premeditatio malorum helps prepare you mentally. When you're drowning in information and opinions, the Stoic reminder that most of it doesn't matter provides relief. Modern people are discovering that Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in a military tent during a plague, dealing with wars and political instability and personal loss, has something to say to them. That his struggles weren't so different from theirs. That his solutions might work for them too. Silicon Valley executives read Stoic philosophy to handle the stress of their high-pressure jobs. Athletes use Stoic techniques to maintain focus and handle defeat. Therapists teach Stoic concepts to clients dealing with anxiety and depression. Ordinary people read the meditations before bed, finding comfort in the words of an ancient emperor who couldn't sleep either. And here's what's beautiful about this. The philosophy keeps adapting, keeps finding new forms, keeps reaching new people. You have modern Stoics trying to figure out how these ancient ideas apply to contemporary challenges. How do you practice Stoic acceptance in the face of climate change? How do you balance Stoic focus on what you can control with the need for collective action on social issues? How do you apply virtue ethics in a pluralistic society where people disagree about what virtue means? These are good questions, important questions, and people are working through them, just as every generation has worked through how to apply Stoic principles to their particular circumstances. Some scholars worry about pop Stoicism, the simplified, commercialized version of Stoicism that appears in self-help books and motivational posts. They worry it loses the depth and sophistication of the original philosophy. And they have a point. When you reduce Stoicism to control what you can control and don't worry about what you can't, you're leaving out a lot of important nuance. You're losing the Stoic physics and logic, the metaphysical framework that grounded the ethics. You're simplifying complex practices into sound bites. But you know what? That's okay. That's how ideas survive. They simplify. They adapt. They meet people where they are. Not everyone needs to read the full corpus of Stoic texts. Not everyone needs to understand the technical distinctions between types of indifference or the proper categories of virtue. Some people just need a few simple principles that help them get through the day. If reading one quote from Marcus Aurelius helps someone handle a difficult boss, or cope with a health diagnosis, or maintain patience with a difficult child, that's valuable. That's the philosophy working. Even if the person never reads the full meditations, never learns about Stoic physics, never studies the technical arguments. Let me tell you about the most profound legacy of Stoicism, though. It's not the books that survived, or the famous people who studied it, or the therapeutic techniques derived from it. It's this. The Stoics figured out something essential about human psychology and taught us that we can work with our own minds. That we're not helpless victims of our emotions and reactions. That we can examine our thoughts, question our assumptions, and choose our responses. This seems obvious now, but it wasn't always. For most of human history, people thought emotions just happened to you, like weather. You got angry because something angering occurred. You got sad because something sad happened. Your feelings were direct responses to external events, and you had little control over them. The Stoics said, wait, there's a step in between. There's the event, and then there's your judgment about the event, and then there's your emotion. You can work with that middle step. You can change your judgments, and thereby change your emotions. This is psychological sophistication that wouldn't be matched until modern cognitive psychology. And the Stoics didn't just theorize about it. They developed practical exercises for actually doing it, for training yourself to respond differently, for building new habits of thought. They taught that you could be your own therapist, in a sense, that through daily practice, through constant attention to your thoughts and reactions, through repeatedly choosing better responses, you could genuinely change how your mind works. And they were right. Modern neuroscience confirms it. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways, means that consistent mental practice actually changes brain structure. When you repeatedly practice responding differently to situations, you're literally rewiring your brain. The Stoics didn't know about neurons and synapses, but they knew it worked. They knew that the person who practices Stoic exercises for years becomes genuinely calmer, more resilient, more capable of maintaining equanimity. Not because they're suppressing emotions, but because their brain has learned new patterns of response. Here's what this means for you, lying there tonight, thinking about your own life and challenges. You're part of this story. You're the latest chapter in a tradition that stretches back 23 centuries to Zeno teaching in his painted porch in Athens. When you try to focus on what you can control instead of worrying about what you can't, you're practicing the same technique Epictetus taught his students. When you examine your anxious thoughts and realize they're just thoughts, not facts, you're doing what Marcus Aurelius did by candlelight in his military tent. You don't have to be perfect at it. Marcus wasn't perfect at it. Seneca certainly wasn't. They struggled. They failed. They had to keep reminding themselves of the same lessons, over and over, but they kept trying. And that's the practice. Not achieving some perfect state of Stoic calm, but engaging in the ongoing process of working with your own mind, of choosing your responses, of trying to live according to your values even when it's hard. This is the legacy, not a set of doctrines to memorize or a system to master, but a practice to engage in, a way of relating to your own experience, a toolkit for living. And the remarkable thing is that this legacy is still alive, still evolving, still helping people. The philosophy that helped a Roman emperor cope with plague and war now helps a modern person cope with work stress and relationship difficulties and existential anxiety. Different contexts, same human mind, same fundamental challenges of being alive and conscious and trying to live well. There's something deeply comforting in this continuity, isn't there? In knowing that you're not alone in your struggles, that people 20 centuries ago faced similar challenges and developed tools that still work. That Marcus Aurelius's insomnia and your insomnia are connected across time. That his efforts to be patient and kind despite difficulty are the same as your efforts. The Stoic secret, that emperors struggled just like everyone else, that philosophy is about practice, not perfection, that we're all trying to figure this out, wasn't really a secret after all. Or rather, it was a secret that kept being rediscovered, generation after generation, finding the same truth, that the examined life is worth living. that working with your own mind matters, that virtue and character are what last. Zeno probably couldn't have imagined that his teachings would still be relevant 2,000 years later. Epictetus certainly didn't expect his lecture notes to be read by Navy pilots and Silicon Valley executives. Marcus Aurelius would be astonished to know his private journal became one of the most beloved books in history. But here we are, still reading them, still learning from them, still finding value in what they taught. Because the truth they taught isn't ancient or modern. It's timeless. Human nature doesn't change that much. The challenges of being alive, dealing with loss, handling difficulty, maintaining integrity, finding meaning. These are constant across cultures and centuries. And the Stoic response to these challenges works. Not perfectly, not for everyone, not for every situation, but well enough, often enough, to have survived 2 millennia of history. Well enough to have helped emperors and slaves, prisoners and philosophers, ancient Romans and modern readers lying in bed trying to quiet their minds. That's a legacy worth honoring, worth learning from, worth passing on. So sleep now, knowing you're part of an ancient tradition, knowing that tomorrow, when challenges arise, you have tools to handle them, knowing that trying to live well, even when you fail, is enough. The emperors knew this, and now you do too. Living the philosophy, culture, and daily life, the Stoic in the streets of Rome. Let's walk through a day, shall we? Not a dramatic day of imperial decisions or philosophical breakthroughs, but an ordinary day. The kind of day that made up most of the lives of our Stoic philosophers, even the emperors. Because philosophy isn't just about ideas. It's about how you eat breakfast, how you greet the people you meet, how you handle the small irritations that fill ordinary hours. It's dawn in Rome, not the Rome of movies with gleaming white marble everywhere. That's a myth, by the way. Rome was colorful, painted, decorated with reds and yellows and blues. But let's say you're Marcus Aurelius, and you're waking up in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. You don't want to get up. This is in the Meditations. Marcus wrote about struggling to get out of bed in the morning. He'd remind himself, at dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for? Even emperors struggle with Monday mornings, apparently. You get up, you're slaves. Because yes, even our philosophical emperor owned slaves, a moral blind spot we'll come back to, help you dress. A tunic first, probably wool, though yours is finer quality than most. In winter, you might wear several tunics layered. Then a toga if you have official duties, though togas are uncomfortable and you avoid them when possible. Here's something most people don't realize. Romans didn't wear togas every day. Togas were formal wear for official business and public appearances. At home, you wore tunics. More comfortable, more practical. Even emperors preferred comfort when no one was watching. You perform your morning ablutions. Romans were particular about cleanliness, though their standards were different from ours. You wash your face and hands. You use a chamber pot. Indoor plumbing existed, but not in bedrooms. You clean your teeth, probably with a powder made from crushed bone and oyster shells. Toothbrushes haven't been invented yet, so you use your finger or a cloth. Then, the morning practice. This is where Stoicism becomes daily routine rather than abstract philosophy. If you're Marcus Aurelius, you sit quietly and practice what we talked about earlier, premeditatio malorum. You imagine the difficult people you'll encounter today, the senators who will waste your time with petty concerns, the advisors who will bring bad news from the frontier, the courtiers seeking favors. You prepare yourself mentally. You remind yourself that their behavior is outside your control. Your response is within it. You might read something philosophical, a few passages from Epictetus, perhaps, whose teachings you love. Or you might write in your journal those entries that will become the meditations. Not long passages necessarily, sometimes just a sentence or two, a reminder, a note to yourself about how to handle the day ahead. If you're Seneca, your morning routine might include some voluntary discomfort, a cold bath, perhaps, simple food for breakfast when you could have delicacies. The practice of poverty we discussed earlier, done regularly to maintain perspective. If you're Epictetus, your morning is probably simpler. You live modestly by choice and necessity. A small meal, some time in contemplation, preparing your lectures for the students who will arrive later. Now, let's talk about breakfast. Romans didn't make a big deal of the first meal. Ientaculum, they called it, and it was usually simple. Bread, perhaps with cheese or olives. Some fruit, maybe leftover from yesterday's dinner. Water or diluted wine to drink. Yes, even in the morning, though the wine was mixed with water at ratios that made it barely alcoholic. The Stoics ate simply, at least in theory. Epictetus taught that you should be grateful for whatever food is before you. Don't complain about the quality or wish for something fancier. It's just fuel for your body, and your body doesn't need luxury to function. Marcus Aurelius took this seriously. Despite having access to the finest foods in the empire, he often ate simply. His physician Galen complained about this, actually, thought the emperor should eat better, take more care of his health. But Marcus saw elaborate meals as an unnecessary indulgence. He had more important things to think about. Seneca, on the other hand, lived with the contradiction we've discussed. He wrote beautiful passages about simple living and the virtue of poverty, while dining on delicacies in his luxurious villas. He was aware of the irony. He wrote about it. He'd point out that practicing philosophy doesn't mean you can't have wealth. It means you shouldn't be attached to it. You should be able to lose it without distress. Easy to say when you haven't lost it, of course. His critics noted this. They still do. After breakfast, the day's work begins. And here's where we see how Stoicism functioned in actual Roman life, not just in theory. Let's say you're Marcus Aurelius. Your day is full of duties. You have audiences to grant, people who need decisions from the emperor, legal cases to judge. The emperor was the highest court of appeal. Military reports to review, letters from governors to read and answer, Senate meetings to attend, though by this period the Senate's power is mostly ceremonial. Financial matters, building projects, religious ceremonies, your Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. Even though you're philosophically a Stoic who sees the gods as aspects of universal reason rather than the personal beings most Romans believe in. How do you apply Stoic principles to imperial administration? You try to be just, to treat each case on its merits, to not let your mood affect your judgments. If you're tired or frustrated, you notice that, acknowledge it, and don't let it influence your decisions. You practice patience. The senators are verbose and tedious. That's their nature. The petitioners are grasping and ungrateful. They don't understand the bigger picture. You can't control their behavior, only your response to it. You remember that you're going to die someday, probably soon. You're not healthy, and life expectancy, even for emperors, isn't long. This helps you keep perspective. Does this minor administrative problem really matter in the grand scheme of things? Will you wish, on your deathbed, that you'd gotten angrier at that incompetent governor? Here's something beautiful. We know some specific examples of Marcus Aurelius applying Stoic principles to real situations. There was a case of a senator who'd been accused of plotting against Marcus. The evidence was thin. The Senate wanted Marcus to execute him anyway, show strength, discourage potential rebels. Marcus refused. He said the evidence wasn't sufficient. He wouldn't kill a man based on suspicion. This is Stoicism in action. The easy choice, the politically safe choice, was execution. But was it just? No. So Marcus didn't do it, even though it might make him look weak. Another example, when his co-emperor Lucius Verus died, there were rumors that Marcus had him poisoned. Marcus ignored the rumors, didn't defend himself, didn't seek out and punish the rumor spreaders. He wrote in his meditations about not caring what others think of you, as long as you know you've acted rightly. How much time he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only at what he himself does, to make it just and holy. He lived this. It must have been hard to have people think you murdered your brother and not defend yourself. But he trusted that his character would speak for itself, that defending his reputation was outside his control and therefore not worth his energy. Let's talk about the main meal of the day, cena, dinner, eaten in the afternoon. This was the social meal, the important one. And it's where we can see Roman culture and Stoic philosophy intersecting in fascinating ways. If you're wealthy, and Seneca certainly was, Marcus Aurelius by definition, you recline to eat. Yes, recline. On couches arranged around 3 sides of a table. You prop yourself on your left elbow and eat with your right hand. Slaves serve the food. There might be entertainment, musicians, dancers, poetry readings. The meal has multiple courses. Gusttatio, appetizers, eggs, vegetables, shellfish. Then the main courses, minci primi. Multiple dishes, meat, fish, vegetables, grain dishes, elaborate sauces. Then dessert, minci secundi. Fruits, nuts, sweet cakes. Wine flows throughout, mixed with water at varying ratios. Getting drunk is considered somewhat crude, but being moderately tipsy is socially acceptable. Expected, even. Now, how does a Stoic navigate this? Because remember, Stoicism isn't about rejecting pleasure. It's about not being controlled by pleasure, not needing it, being able to enjoy it without attachment. Seneca's dinner parties were famous. Philosophical discussion mixed with good food and wine. He'd invite interesting guests, poets, philosophers, politicians. The conversation was the point, really. The food was just the setting. But Seneca also practiced his voluntary poverty exercises. Some days, he'd eat only bread and water while his guests enjoyed delicacies. He wanted to prove to himself and demonstrate to others that he didn't need the luxury, that he could take it or leave it. Marcus Aurelius approached dinners differently. He attended them because it was his duty as emperor, but he didn't seem to particularly enjoy them. He'd rather be reading philosophy or writing in his journal. social obligation, not pleasure. Let's talk about something Romans were obsessed with that might surprise you: the baths. Roman bathing culture was elaborate. Public baths were social centers, like a combination of gym, spa, and community center. You'd go in the afternoon, after work. You'd exercise first: weights, ball games, wrestling. Then the bathing sequence: tepidarium, warm room; caldarium, hot room; frigidarium, cold plunge. You'd scrape oil and dirt off your skin with a curved tool called a strigil. Soap existed but wasn't common yet. You'd chat with friends, discuss business, hear gossip. The baths were noisy, crowded, chaotic. People shouting, water splashing, vendors hawking food and drinks, musicians performing. Seneca lived above a bathhouse once and wrote a hilarious letter about the noise. He describes every sound in detail: the grunting of men exercising, the slapping sound of massages, the shouts of the scorekeeper in the ball games, the splashing, the vendors crying their wares. You can hear his exasperation through the centuries. But then he makes a Stoic point: these noises only bother me if I judge them as bothersome. They're just sounds. I can choose to be disturbed or not. Easy to say, harder to live by when you're trying to sleep and there's constant noise. But that's the practice. Not achieving perfect equanimity, but working toward it. Let's talk about something Romans did that seems strange to us. They had almost no privacy. Not even emperors. If you're Marcus Aurelius, you're rarely alone. There are always slaves around, always attendants, always someone who needs something. Your bedroom has slaves sleeping nearby in case you need something in the night. When you bathe, slaves help you. When you dress, slaves help you. When you work, scribes and advisors are present. Privacy as we understand it, being truly alone, unwatched, unattended, was rare and usually undesirable. To be alone meant you were poor, without servants, or exiled, or abandoned. So when did Stoics practice their philosophy? How did they find quiet for contemplation? Early morning, before the household fully awoke. Late at night, after everyone slept. Stolen moments during the day. Marcus wrote his meditations whenever he could, in military camps, between duties, probably sometimes while officially working on something else. The Stoics developed the ability to be alone in a crowd, to maintain inner quiet despite external chaos. They had to. Roman life didn't offer much alternative. This is why Stoic philosophy emphasizes internal freedom so much. Because external freedom was limited for everyone. Even emperors were constrained by duty, obligation, expectation. Slaves obviously had no external freedom at all. But your mind, your will, your character, those could be free even when everything else was constrained. Let's talk about something important: the Stoics and slavery. Because this is where ancient philosophy shows its limitations, where we see that even wise people are products of their time. Rome was a slave society. Perhaps 30% of the population were enslaved. Slavery wasn't based on race. It was based on conquest, debt, birth, or bad luck. Anyone could potentially become a slave. But once enslaved, you were property. You had no legal rights. Your owner could do anything to you. And the Stoics owned slaves. Marcus Aurelius owned hundreds. Seneca owned many. They participated in the system without apparently seeing any contradiction. How could they? How could philosophers who taught universal human equality, who said we're all part of the same rational order, who emphasized treating everyone with respect, how could they own other human beings? The answer is uncomfortable. They compartmentalized. They made a distinction between natural slavery and conventional slavery. Some people, they thought, were slaves by nature, lacked reason or self-control. But most slaves were slaves only by convention, by legal status. In their true nature, their rational souls, they were equal. Epictetus taught this explicitly. He'd been a slave himself, remember. He taught that slavery couldn't touch your true self. Your body could be enslaved, but you will remain free. No one could force you to make a particular judgment or have a particular opinion. This is profound as psychology. As a survival strategy for enslaved people, it's valuable. But as social ethics, it's inadequate. It makes peace with an unjust system rather than challenging it. We can acknowledge this failure without dismissing everything else the Stoics taught. They were limited by their historical context. They couldn't see beyond the assumptions of their society on this issue. Just as future generations will likely look back at our time and be horrified by blind spots we don't recognize, by injustices we participate in without seeing them as unjust. This is humbling to remember. The wisest people of any era are still limited, still flawed, still products of their culture. We can learn from the Stoics while acknowledging they weren't perfect. We can take what's valuable, the psychological insights, the practical techniques, while rejecting what isn't. Let me tell you about Roman religion, because this is where Stoic philosophy intersected with everyday culture in interesting ways. Romans were religious in their way. They made offerings to household gods, the Lares and Penates. They participated in state religious ceremonies. They consulted omens before important decisions. They believed in divination, reading the future from lightning, from bird flight, from the entrails of sacrificed animals. But educated Romans, especially by the imperial period, were often skeptical about the literal truth of religious myths. They didn't really believe Jupiter was a bearded man sitting on a cloud. They didn't think Venus was literally born from sea foam. Instead, they interpreted the gods allegorically. Jupiter represented authority and justice. Venus represented love and beauty. The myths were seen as teaching stories, not historical accounts. The Stoics took this further. They saw the gods as aspects of a single divine reason, the logos that organized the universe. All the various gods were just different names for different aspects of this universal rationality. So when Marcus Aurelius, as Pontifex Maximus, performed religious ceremonies, was he being hypocritical? Did he actually believe in the gods he was honoring? Sort of. Not in the naive way, but he believed in divine order, in a rational principle organizing reality, in something worthy of reverence. The ceremonies were a way of acknowledging that, expressing it in traditional forms that the people understood. He was philosophical in private, conventionally religious in public. This was normal for educated Romans. They didn't see it as contradictory. Let me tell you about Roman attitudes toward death, because this is where Stoicism most clearly influenced daily life. Romans were familiar with death. Life expectancy was perhaps 25 to 30 years at birth, though this is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survive childhood, you might live to 50 or 60. But death was always near. Infant mortality was around 30%. Plague swept through regularly. Wounds became infected. Women died in childbirth. Diseases we can cure easily were often fatal. So Romans thought about death a lot. They had elaborate funeral customs. They kept death masks of ancestors and displayed them in their homes. They built impressive tombs along the roads leading into cities. You can still see these along the Appian Way. But they were also pragmatic about death. It was natural, inevitable. You couldn't avoid it, so why fear it? This is where Stoicism fit perfectly with Roman culture. The Stoics taught that death is natural and nothing to fear, that it's just a return to the elements you were made from, that fighting against death is irrational. You're fighting against nature itself. Marcus Aurelius meditated on death constantly, not morbidly, but as a practice. Remembering death helped him appreciate life. It kept him from wasting time on trivial concerns. It reminded him that nothing lasts forever, so he should make good use of the time he had. You could leave life right now, he wrote. Let that determine what you do and say and think. If you knew you'd die tomorrow, would you be arguing about this petty matter? Holding this grudge? Worrying about that person's opinion? Probably not. So why do it now, when death might come any day? Let's talk about family life, because Stoicism had interesting things to say about relationships and emotions. If you're Marcus Aurelius, you have children. Lots of them. He and Faustina had at least 13, though only 6 survived to adulthood. Infant death was so common that there were special terms for it, special prayers, special coping strategies. How do you apply Stoic principles to parenthood? To the constant worry that your children might die, the knowledge that they probably will before reaching adulthood? Epictetus taught a practice that sounds harsh. When you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself that this child is mortal. They might die tonight. This isn't to make you sad, it's to make you present, to help you appreciate them now, to prepare you for possible loss. Marcus Aurelius lost several children. The Meditations don't talk much about this. They're not a personal diary in that sense. But there are hints of grief, references to accepting what the universe gives and takes, reminders that all things are temporary. Did Stoicism help him with this grief? Maybe. It probably didn't eliminate the pain. Philosophy can't do that. But it might have prevented the pain from destroying him. Might have helped him continue functioning as emperor even while mourning as a father. There's a story that when one of Marcus's sons died, his advisors found him crying. They were surprised. They expected Stoic equanimity. But Marcus said something like, "Let me be human for a moment." Even in grief, he was practicing philosophy, acknowledging the emotion, not suppressing it, but also not being overwhelmed by it. Let's talk about marriage. Seneca's marriage to Paulina was apparently happy, or at least committed. When he was ordered to commit suicide, she wanted to die with him. Nero prevented this, forced her to live. But the fact that she was willing tells us something about their bond. Marcus Aurelius's marriage to Faustina was more complicated. There were rumors about her infidelity, probably false, probably political slander, but persistent. Marcus never publicly doubted her, never responded to the rumors. After she died, he had her deified, which emperors could do for family members. Was this Stoic practice, not caring about others' opinions, trusting your own judgment? Or was it denial? We can't know. Maybe both. The Stoics taught that you should love your family without anxious attachment. Enjoy them. Care for them, but remember they're mortal. Remember they might die or leave or change. Your relationship with them is partly outside your control. They have their own wills, their own choices. You can control how you treat them. You can't control how they respond. This is psychologically sophisticated but emotionally difficult. How do you love someone without attachment? How do you care deeply while holding lightly? The Stoics would say, by remembering that all things are temporary. That change is natural. That holding on too tightly causes suffering. Love fully in the present moment, without demanding the present moment last forever. Easier said than done. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly, which suggests he struggled with it constantly. Let's talk about work, because most Romans, most people in history, spent most of their time working. If you weren't wealthy, you worked hard, long hours, physical labor mostly. You might be a baker, starting work before dawn to have bread ready by morning. A blacksmith, working in heat and smoke. A merchant, traveling dangerous roads. A farmer, entirely dependent on weather and harvest. A construction worker, building the monuments we now admire. A teacher, barely scraping by. A prostitute, sex work was common and not particularly stigmatized, though it was low status. How does Stoicism apply to ordinary work? To exhaustion and low pay and danger and uncertainty? Epictetus taught poor students, remember, people who would work with their hands, who'd never have leisure for extended philosophical study. He gave them practical advice. Do your work well, whatever it is. Take pride in your craft. Don't resent the circumstances you're in. Resentment doesn't change them and makes you miserable. Find meaning in doing your work excellently. This can sound like a philosophy that justifies the status quo, that tells poor people to accept their lot rather than fighting for better conditions. And it's been used that way throughout history. Be content in your station has been preached to keep people from demanding justice. But that's not quite what the Stoics taught. They said, you can't always change external circumstances. So don't make yourself miserable wishing for different circumstances. But you can control how you do your work. You can choose to do it with skill and dignity. You can find satisfaction in excellence, regardless of status. There's a story about Epictetus and a lamp. After his death, someone bought his lamp at auction for 3,000 drachmas, a huge sum, because it was Epictetus's lamp, touched by wisdom. Epictetus would have laughed. It's just a lamp, a tool. What mattered wasn't the lamp, but how he used it to light his study, to teach his students, to practice philosophy. The object has no special value. The use does. Let me tell you about friendship, because this is where Stoicism was beautiful and human. Seneca wrote extensively about friendship in his letters to Lucilius. He clearly treasured this friendship. His letters are warm, personal, supportive. He shared his thoughts, his struggles, his progress in philosophy. He encouraged Lucilius, celebrated his successes, sympathized with his difficulties. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was a real relationship between two people who cared about each other. The Stoics valued friendship highly. They saw it as essential to human flourishing. Not because you need friends to be happy. The Stoic sage would be content alone, but because friendship is an opportunity to practice virtue, to be loyal, honest, supportive, kind. A good friend, the Stoics taught, is like a second self, someone who shares your values, who helps you become better, Who calls you out when you're rationalizing or making mistakes? Who celebrates your progress? This is different from networking or using people. You don't befriend someone for what they can do for you. You befriend them because they're virtuous, because you enjoy their company, because helping them is its own reward. Marcus Aurelius clearly valued his teachers deeply. The first book of the Meditations is all acknowledgments, thanking specific people for specific lessons. These weren't formal obligations. These were real relationships that shaped him. And this is one of the most appealing aspects of Stoicism, honestly. It's not cold. It's not isolated. It recognizes that we're social beings who need connection. It just tries to make those connections healthy, based on virtue rather than neediness, on genuine care rather than anxious attachment. Let's talk about entertainment, because Romans knew how to have fun, and Stoics had complicated relationships with pleasure. There were the games, gladiatorial combats, chariot races, animal hunts in the arena. Romans loved these. They were violent, exciting, communal experiences. Everyone went. Everyone had opinions about their favorite gladiators or racing teams. Marcus Aurelius disliked them, as we mentioned, but most Romans, including many Stoics, attended. They'd say, "It's outside my control whether these games exist. I can't change Roman culture single-handedly, so I might as well attend, fulfill my social obligations, but not let the excitement carry me away. Watch without becoming obsessed. Appreciate the skill without bloodlust." Theater was more respectable. Comedy, tragedy, pantomime. Romans loved drama. They'd quote lines from plays, discuss the performances. Theater was educational, in a way, teaching through stories, showing examples of virtue and vice. Dinner parties, as we discussed, conversation, debate, music, poetry readings. These were primary entertainment for educated Romans. For ordinary Romans, entertainment was simpler. Taverns, gambling, street performances, religious festivals with public feasting, the baths, which were free or cheap and served as social centers. The Stoic approach to all of this: enjoy it if you want, but don't need it. Don't become dependent on entertainment for happiness. Be able to enjoy a good dinner party and be equally content with a quiet evening at home. Appreciate beauty without craving it. Experience pleasure without attachment. As the day ends, let's say you're Marcus Aurelius again. You perform your evening practice. This is important. The day's end is for reflection. You review your day. What did you do well? Where did you fail? When did you lose your temper? When were you patient? When did you act justly? When did you let fear or desire control you? This isn't about guilt. It's about learning, about noticing patterns, about gradually improving. Seneca described this practice in detail. He'd lie in bed at night and examine his day like a judge examining a case. What did I do today? Why did I do it? Could I have done better? He'd ask himself specific questions. Was I helpful to anyone? Did I control my temper? Did I speak harshly? Did I waste time? And if he'd failed, he'd remind himself, tomorrow is another chance. Every day is a fresh start. The past can't be changed, but the future can. This is cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, this is the examined life. This is how you gradually change your character, through consistent, honest self-reflection and commitment to improvement. The house quiets. Slaves secure the doors. Oil lamps flicker and are extinguished. In Rome, Most people go to bed when it gets dark. Artificial light is expensive. Only the wealthy stay up late with many lamps burning. You lie in bed. Maybe you read a bit by lamplight. Philosophy, probably. Something to settle your mind. Something to remind you of what matters. Or maybe you just lie there, practicing the evening reflection we discussed, reviewing your day, preparing mentally for tomorrow, practicing that acceptance of whatever comes. You remember that you might die tonight. This isn't morbid, it's reality. People die in their sleep. It happens. Are you ready? Have you lived today in a way you're proud of? If tonight is your last night, can you accept that? The Stoics believe that if you've lived virtuously, death holds no terror. You've done what you came to do. You've played your role in the cosmic order. What more is there? So you settle into sleep at peace, or working toward peace, because the practice never ends. Tomorrow is another day to try again, to practice virtue, to work with your own mind, to live according to philosophy. This is what it meant to be a Stoic in ancient Rome. Not just reading books or memorizing doctrines, but integrating philosophy into every aspect of daily life. From waking up reluctantly in the morning to reviewing your day before sleep. From eating breakfast to attending dinner parties. From dealing with difficult people to enjoying friendships. From working to relaxing. From loving your family to accepting loss. It was a complete approach to living, a set of practices that shaped character over time, a way of being human that acknowledged difficulty while striving for excellence. The culture is gone. The Roman Empire fell centuries ago. The specific context, the slavery, the gender roles, the religious beliefs, the social structures, all of that is dead and mostly unlamented. But the practices remain. The psychological insights remain. The recognition that we can work with our own minds, choose our responses, find meaning in virtue, that remains. Because human psychology hasn't changed. The challenges of being alive, dealing with difficulty, handling loss, maintaining integrity, finding peace, these haven't changed. And the Stoic response to these challenges still works. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but well enough that people are still practicing it, still learning from it, still finding value in it. Including you, perhaps, lying there tonight, thinking about these ancient Romans and their daily lives. Thinking about how their struggles mirror yours, how their practices might help you. They'd be pleased to know this, I think. These philosophers who cared so much about how to live, who wrote and taught and practiced, hoping their ideas would help people. They helped each other. They help us still. And tomorrow, when you wake up and don't want to get out of bed, you can remember Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, struggling with the same thing, reminding himself of his purpose, choosing to begin again. That's the practice. Always beginning again, always trying, always working toward virtue, even when you fail. Sleep now. Tomorrow is another day to practice. Rest well, knowing you're part of an ancient tradition of people trying to live well. The emperors understood this. The philosophers understood this. And now you understand it too.